Senator Wells.
Thank you, Speaker. Colleagues, I rise today as the Senate sponsor of Bill C-234, an act to amend the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act, which was introduced in the other place by Member of Parliament Ben Lobb on February 7, 2022. This bill was recently passed through the other place with the support of the Bloc Québécois, the Conservatives, and the New Democratic Party, along with a few Liberal MPs. It's truly a cross-party effort and is a much-needed piece of legislation. The objective of this bill is quite simple, and that is to create additional on-farm exemptions from the carbon tax for critical farming practices, such as grain drying, heating and cooling livestock barns and greenhouses, steam flaking and irrigation. When the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act, or GGPPA for short, was adopted in June 2018, the bill imposed a fuel charge on fossil fuels like gasoline and natural gas. The fuel charge is applicable in all provinces and territories which do not have their own federally approved carbon pricing systems. This currently includes Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, Yukon, and Nunavut. On July 1st of this year, the Atlantic provinces will be added to that list as well. Under the GGPPA, gasoline and diesel fuel used by farmers in eligible farming machinery, such as trucks and tractors, is already exempt from the carbon tax. In addition, the Act provides an exemption of up to 80% of the carbon tax for natural gas and propane used to heat an eligible greenhouse. But what the current legislation does not include is an exemption for natural gas or propane used for on-farm activities such as grain dryers and heating barns. This was a critical oversight which Bill C-234 seeks to correct. Colleagues, as we all know, natural gas is a transition fuel. Liberal MP Cody Blois, member from Kings Hants, Nova Scotia, said in the other place, "At the time the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act was developed, it seems as though there was not necessarily a lot of thought given to grain drying and particularly to barn heating for livestock. That is exactly what this bill tries to do. It would extend to what a number of policymakers feel was an oversight at the time of the original drafting of the legislation that brought the carbon price into force." Close quote. As senators know, the purpose of the carbon tax is to provide an economic incentive through a price signal to encourage people to shift their energy consumption from fossil fuels to other sustainable energy options. But when it comes to agriculture, this poses a number of problems. The first is that farmers have no viable sources of alternative energy for their agricultural practices. This is widely recognized, as noted by New Democratic Member of Parliament Alistair McGregor at the House Agriculture Committee. He noted that, quote, "We realize that a price on carbon is there to incentivize a change in behavior, but it doesn't work well if there aren't commercially viable alternatives available." Close quote. This is the first fundamental reality which underscores the importance of Bill C-234. The law currently penalizes farmers for something over which they have no control. They cannot shift their energy use away from fossil fuels because alternatives are not yet available. This makes the current situation punitive and fundamentally unfair. It is recognized, however, that the current lack of renewable energy options for farmers could change. Research and development is already underway to develop renewable energy sources for farm production, including biomass, geothermal, hydroelectric, solar, and wind power. Although these options have not yet reached the stage of development where they are workable options to replace the farm use of fossil fuels, that day will come. For this reason, the bill includes an 8-year sunset clause. On the 8th anniversary of Bill C-234 coming into force, the changes made to the GGPPA by this bill will be automatically repealed, reverting the legislation to its current state. If, however, the government of the day believes they should not be repealed, then the legislation allows both houses of Parliament to debate and vote on a proposed extension. This would remove the need to relitigate a similar piece of legislation if at the time it's found that an exemption from the carbon tax on farm fuels is still needed. The second reason the carbon tax imposes significant problems on farms is because farmers are price takers, not price makers. This is a long-standing and well-understood reality. Farmers must sell their production at the prevailing market price, and they have no control over that price. If their expenses are increased, they cannot pass those on. They simply must absorb them. This is the reality that farmers face today because of the lack of sufficient agriculture exemptions in the GGPPA. Bloc Québécois Member of Parliament Yves Perron put it this way, quote, "Without an alternative, if we impose a tax on these processes at this time, it would simply increase production cost and reduce farmers' profit margins, since they have no other options." This, close quote. This, colleagues, is the current reality on farms which are located in federal backstop provinces and territories. Farmers and ranchers require propane and or natural gas to dry their grain, irrigate their land, or heat and cool their barns and greenhouses in order to feed Canadians and drive our export market. Yet they are unable to pass the cost of the carbon tax on to consumers and are left to absorb the additional expense. In April 2022, the Parliamentary Budget Officer estimated that the cost of the carbon tax on natural gas and propane used in the agricultural sector in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Ontario would cost agricultural producers $235 million from 2020-2021 to 2024-2025. Over the next 10 years, this total will reach $1.1 billion. This has been corroborated by studies completed by numerous agricultural organizations. The Agricultural Producers Association of Saskatchewan calculated the carbon tax at $50 per tonne to cost farmers between $13,000 and $17,000 annually, the equivalent of a 12% decrease in net income. At $170 per tonne, they estimated the carbon tax will cost a grain farmer $12.52 per acre by 2030. The Keystone Agricultural Producers reported that Manitoba producers pay $1.7 million in carbon taxes related to drying grain in 2019. Examples include a producer growing 250 acres of corn spending $33,664 on propane to dry their crop, with the carbon tax adding another $1,043 to their fuel bill, and a chicken farmer heating a barn from October 24th, 2019 to January 21st, 2020, spending $5,935 on natural gas, with the carbon tax adding another $1,300 to their fuel bill, or 22.16%. The grain farmers of Ontario have noted that under the current legislation, the tax credit returns less than 20% of the carbon tax cost. They estimate when the carbon tax reaches $170 per tonne, some farmers would pay between $50,000 and $70,000 just in carbon taxes. The Canola Growers Association calculated that the carbon tax would cost their industry $52.1 million in 2022 at $50 a tonne and $277.9 million in 2030 at $170 per tonne. The cumulative cost of the carbon tax to the industry from 2022 to 2030 would be $1.429 billion. Colleagues, input costs are the greatest expenses on Canadian farms, and farmers and ranchers are already judicious in their use of natural gas and propane on farms. Carbon surcharges on those fuels only serve to reduce the financial resources available for producers to invest in efficiencies that mitigate the costs and reduce emissions, such as a more efficient grain dryer, precision agriculture equipment, solar panels, LED lighting, heat exchangers for barns, or anaerobic digesters, just to name a few. And remember, colleagues, in Alberta, southern Alberta in particular, where the farms are plentiful, it can get to minus 40 in the summer, minus 40 in the winter, and plus 40 in the summer. It's so it also not just to be used for heating, but also for cooling, especially when livestock are involved. It's a well-known fact that farmers have a record of being environmental stewards and innovators. They have adopted new technologies and proven their ability to continually lessen their environmental footprint, while increasing production and maintaining their competitiveness, without a carbon price incentivizing them to do so. However, without the changes introduced by Bill C-234, the carbon tax will extract hundreds of millions of dollars from the agriculture sector, reducing the ability of farmers to invest in the capital-intensive innovations and technologies that drive sustainability and productivity gains. This was an unintentional impact of the GGPPA, and Bill C-234 seeks to rectify this oversight. This is not the first time the Senate has had an opportunity to address this unintentional impact. In 2018, the carbon tax was brought in under Part 5 of the Budget Implementation Act in Bill C-74. It was the Senate who was able to conduct a more in-depth study in how this affected agriculture. Unfortunately, this was not addressed as the legislation was pushed through Finance Committee very quickly in the context of an omnibus bill. Subsequently, our House and Senate colleagues similarly sought to correct this omission through Bill C-206, put forth by MP Philip Lawrence. As some of you may recall, it was also attempted by our former colleague, the Honourable Diane Griffin. Her bill sought to amend the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act to modify the definitions of eligible farming machinery and qualifying farming fuel. Colleagues, here we are today with an opportunity to correct a lapse in the law that is now affecting the core of our agriculture system and essentially our food supply. Canada's farmers sit at the heart of an agri-food system which contributes nearly $140 billion to our economy annually and provides 1 in 9 Canadian jobs. Agriculture is an international success story in terms of productivity and innovation, but requires a policy environment that enables our farms to thrive. This bill is not about whether you like the carbon tax. Although Conservatives are opposed to the carbon tax in principle, the NDP, Bloc Québécois, and the Green Party fully support it. Yet all these parties voted in favour of this bill, along with a number of Liberal members, including the chair of the House Standing Committee on Agriculture and Agri-Food, the committee that studied this bill. This bill is not about politics, it's about Canadian farmers. It's not about removing the carbon tax or diminishing its effectiveness. It's about making sure the carbon tax is equitably applied and does not harm our agriculture industry. Colleagues, the scope of this bill is narrow and targeted. It expands the existing list of, quote, eligible farm machinery to include property used for the purpose of providing heating or cooling to a building or similar structure, including those used for raising or housing livestock or for growing crops and drying grain. And secondly, it expands the definition of a qualifying farming fuel to include marketable natural gas and propane. These are reasonable, moderate, and necessary changes and are badly needed and broadly supported across the agricultural sector. Here's what agriculture organizations from across the country have had to say about the need and value of Bill C-234. The Agriculture Carbon Alliance, known as the ACA, is a coalition of 15 national farm organizations representing more than 190,000 farm businesses. I was shocked that there were that many farm businesses in Canada. ACA members include members of the Canadian Canola Growers Association, Canadian Federation of Agriculture, Canadian Cattle Association, Grain Growers of Canada, Canadian Pork Council, Chicken Farmers of Canada, Turkey Farmers of Canada, Fruit and Vegetable Growers of Canada, the Canadian Hatching Egg Producers, Canadian Forage and Grassland Association, the National Sheep Network, National Cattle Feeders Association, Dairy Farmers of Canada, Canadian Seed Growers Association, and Mushrooms Canada. The ACA said, quote, as a national coalition of industry-wide farm organizations, we are focused on prioritizing practical solutions to ensure our farmers and ranchers can remain competitive and utilize the tools available to them where no alternative fuel sources exist. Bill C-234 will provide economic relief for our members, freeing up the working capital they need to implement the environmental innovations on farm. By adopting policies that enable producers to remain competitive, they will be able to further their investments in the sustainability of their operations, which will augment the sector's potential to further lower emissions and sequester carbon. The Canadian Federation of Agriculture stated, producers across Canada are working every day to improve the sustainability of their operations. This continuous improvement is reliant on the commercialization of viable on-farm technologies that come with significant capital expenses. This proposed legislation helps ensure farmers have the capital needed to make those investments and continue to realize the sector's potential as climate solution providers. The Chicken Farmers of Canada stated, Canadian chicken farmers constantly advance our operations in order to improve bird health and welfare and to ameliorate environmental stewardship and sustainability on the farm. Through the implementation of good production practices, chicken farmers are taking steps to ensure that our sector is environmentally sustainable for decades to come. We look to our partners in government and in the other place, he said the House of Commons, to provide legislative and financial support for farmers so we can keep feeding Canadians. The Canadian Pork Council stated, having barn heating costs subject to the carbon price is especially challenging for producers given that they are responsible for the welfare of their animals. In Canada's climate, producers have no choice but to manage the temperatures in barns to ensure the care of our animals. The grain growers of Canada. Canada's grain farmers welcome the introduction of this bill and appreciate the exemptions included for critical on-farm activities, including grain drying. Through this relief from the carbon tax, our farmer members would have additional capital to invest in innovative technologies and sustainable practices that reduce emissions. Canadian hatching egg producers stated, Canada's hatching egg farmers represent an important segment of the poultry industry. Our farmers work hard to be at the forefront of innovation for sustainability while striving for efficiency at every opportunity. Bill C-234 will provide necessary support on farms to help alleviate financial pressures and ensure capital is available to reinvest in our farm operations. Canadian canola growers. Colleagues, I'm near the end of these quotes. Canadian Canola Growers Association. Canola growers are committed to a sustainable future and have established production goals to support that commitment. I've made investments on, this is one of the farmers, I've made investment on my farm to retrofit my natural gas grain dryer, making it more energy efficient. While this is an important step, farmers today simply do not have viable fuel alternatives available for drying grain, which is why Bill C-234 is so important. That's from Mike Amateur, Chair of the Canadian Canola Growers Association. The Canadian Cattlemen's Association. Beef farmers and ranchers are continuously looking at ways to environmentally improve operations and further contribute positively to Canada's climate change objectives. And colleagues, you see a trend in all of these. They want to take these savings and make their systems better. He went on to say, Bill C-234 will provide the much-needed exemptions for critical farming practices, including heating and cooling of livestock barns and steam flaking. The Fruit and Vegetable Growers of Canada said, Canadian fruit and vegetable growers are committed to being a part of the global climate solution and sustainability of their operations. We believe the support for the farmers found in Bill C-234 will incentivize continued innovation and recognizes that farmers need a range of feasible fuel and energy options. Ultimately, this will benefit the entire food value chain, including Canadian consumers. So, colleagues, Bill C-234 is critically necessary for Canadian farmers who are essential to our food supply and security, and it also builds on the multi-party support that Bill C-206 received in 2020 and 2021. I ask for your support, colleagues, for this legislation at second reading and look forward to hearing directly from stakeholders at committee. Thank you.
Senator Batters, you want a question? I have Senator Wu and then Senator Batters. Senator Wu.
Thank you, Senator Wells, for your speech. You make some important points about the unique nature of agriculture in relation to the use of fossil fuels. The value of a carbon tax is greatest when it has few exemptions. So my question with respect to the issue of agriculture being price takers is that prices go up and they go down, of course. Sometimes will prices go up to a point where there are windfall profits for farms, and sometimes they go down to the point where farms are at jeopardy of going bankrupt. The traditional remedy for these kinds of problems in economics is price and income support. Why don't we look to that kind of protection, if I can put it that way, rather than fiddling with the carbon tax and creating a carve-out that might distort incentives away from our combined and collective goal of reducing carbon emissions?
Senator Wells.
Thank you, Senator Wu, for that question. It's a good question. I don't look at this as a carve-out. This is an expansion of the exemptions that were provided in an earlier act. I think there was an oversight, and in fact, the chair of the House Agriculture Committee noted that this was an oversight, and in fact, he supported this bill in the House. This is also part of a program for farmers. I don't think they want subsidies. Perhaps they take them, but I think they just want a business that works for them and where eligible expenses at times where there is alternative fuels or alternative processes that they will use those. Right now, there are no alternative fuels or processes besides natural gas and propane, which are both, as you know, considered transition fuels. So they want to get better, but in the meantime, and that's why there's a sunset clause on this. So it would have to be considered to be renewed. It's not ongoing. It automatically cancels after 8 years. Canadian farmers and growers and ranchers, they want to get better. They're part of the solution in the environmental debate. And I think this exemption simply expands where an oversight occurred in the earlier legislation.
Senator Wu?
Thank you for the explanation. An expansion of an exemption is another word for a carve-out, of course, but I appreciate that that's what you're looking for. Your argument that increasing the margins or preserving the margins of farmers so that they can spend the surpluses on innovative and less carbon-intensive technologies has a logic to it, but the point is that you need some kind of incentive for them to do that, and there's no guarantee that farmers will use the surpluses, fungible as they are, for that particular task. So again, there are other tools in which we can incentivize farmers to use geothermal and solar and whatever else might appear. And this is through the means of direct incentives for those technologies. So why are we not considering these other pathways that on the one hand are consistent with the universality of a carbon tax, recognizes the fluctuations in incomes and prices that farmers inevitably face, but also focus on incentives for specific carbon-reducing technologies that may be available in the years ahead?
Senator Wells.
Thank you. I'm sure. Thank you for the question, Senator Wu. I'm sure those incentives are already there for migrating to alternative sources of fuel that have carbon neutrality, like geothermal, like solar, like wind. But we're not there yet, and we're not there and we may be there in some small-scale operations, but we're not there on an industrial scale. Canada, among most countries, is a world leader in industrial farming. And this is an industrial scale, these are industrial scale operations that don't enjoy the benefit yet of geothermal and all the other things that may occur in the future through innovations or through investments and through other technologies. But this is what we have. The carbon tax is relatively new, and the industry hasn't caught up to it. And one day it will be great, or it would be great if these industrial processes were carbon neutral, of course. But for on-farm, and I still push back on your claim that this is a carve-out, because the system already exists where there are exemptions, and this is just adding to those exemptions. We'll agree to disagree. So this is a further assistance for the ranchers, for the growers, for the farmers to get where they need to be.
Senator Batters.
Thank you very much. Thank you for sponsoring this bill, Senator Wells. It's such an important bill for people in my province of Saskatchewan and farmers all across Canada. Canadian farmers are stewards of the land, and they are extremely innovative on environmentally friendly practices and have been for decades, actually, partly as a result of their desire to preserve the land, but also part of the reason is to keep costs low. So I was actually looking back at a 2020 tweet that I put out about about grain drying and agriculture. And I used the example of Kenton from Humboldt, Saskatchewan, who had sent me his grain drying bill, his Sask Energy bill. And he was billed in 1 month just for carbon tax, almost $3,000 for just 1 month of just carbon tax for grain drying his crop. And there was GST added to that amount. And I've heard that that was actually not that exorbitant of a figure compared to some other farmers. And that was a few years ago. So despite their promises to cap the carbon tax, the Trudeau government's carbon tax has continued to increase. So, and it will continue to do that. So the cost is much even higher than that point. Also, I wanted to mention that food inflation has led to higher prices at the grocery store for all Canadians. So at a time when so many Canadians are struggling just to put food on their table and food bank usage is at an all-time high, Canada's farmers need this carbon tax exemption in this bill to help their farming operations be more viable. But I would like you to explain, if you could, a little bit more so that all Canadians can understand how this impacts them, about how Canadian consumers need this exemption to make food costs at their grocery stores much more affordable.
Senator Wells.
Thank you for your question, Senator Batters. And you know what? If I make this an argument over the ills or gains of the carbon tax, I'll quickly lose the argument in this room. What I see for this, yes, obviously making, giving farmers a better margin on their work would be better for the farmer. And Senator Wu mentioned that prices go up, prices go down. That's true. It seems for our plates right now, the prices are going up. I don't know if the farmer is at the benefit side of those increased prices, because the prices are increasing for the farmer as well, the farmers, growers, and ranchers. When I mention one, I mean them all. This is simply for on-farm equipment, like barns where cattle have to live in the winter and the summer, for drying grain, for all the things that are necessary, for which there is currently no alternative machinery, and secondly, no alternative fuel. And that's the essence of the bill. It's to give that, and to give time for the farmer, the rancher, and the grower to come up to speed by purchasing, developing, innovating technology that will make this carve out, as Senator Wu so incorrectly puts, makes that's what gives them time to do it.
Senator Batters.
I guess I was just reinforcing the point that you made, that farmers are price takers, not for price makers. So if they have increased costs because of carbon tax going up, because of GST on the carbon tax going, having all of that, they have to pass that cost along in order to remain a viable operation. And the cost, of course, gets passed on to the consumer at the grocery store, because groceries obviously don't just fall out of the sky. They come from farmers generally. So at one point or another. So as a result, given the grocery store prices are continuing to go up, perhaps the inflation is flattening a little bit, but it's still very high rate. And so, yeah, would you just tell us a little bit more about how farmers, the food that they produce, whether that be grain or cattle or chickens, all these kinds of things, that is what results in higher costs at the grocery stores?
Thank you, Senator Batters, again. In farmers and ranchers and growers being price takers, it's really, their markets are commodity markets. So the price of hogs, the price of wheat, all these things, they can't say, well, like in a grocery store, the grocery store owner might say, well, I'm going to charge this for this, this price for this can of whatever it is, because I have a choice to do that. The farmer has no choice. The farmer has no choice, and any price differential wouldn't happen in that year. That would happen in the next year. But when you look at it, there are so many things globally that account for a price. Droughts in different areas of the world, flooding in other areas, or there's just so many things. So the farmer gets what the farmer gets. They don't have a great deal of choice. Any thought that this is passed on to the consumer, which absolutely it is. The consumer is the one that pays for the end product regardless. which gives even more credence to the necessity for farmers to have as much margin as they can to invest in the things that they know they're going to need to invest in. It's only getting more costly. It's not getting less costly, especially with the price of fuel, the price of equipment. And this goes directly to that, for which there are no other alternatives, both in fuel and equipment.
Honourable Senators, I have four senators on my list for questions. Senator Quinn, Senator Dalphond, Senator Carter, Senatrice Gagné. Senator Quinn.
Thank you, Speaker. Senator Wells, would you take a question?
I certainly would, Senator Quinn.
Thank you. Thank you so much for a very informative speech. It was really underscored the importance of the issue that's being dealt with. And the people that I've been meeting with from the various associations that you've talked to, the one thing that's really stood out for me in relation to other discussions that have happened here around the agricultural industry, there's something that you said in your speech that resonated with me, and that was food security. You alluded to food security. And I'm somewhat concerned that the farming industry and as price takers are continuing to face challenges such that the next generation is having less and less interest in taking over or getting involved in that business, which backs into the question of food security. I would suggest we could wait to see what other approaches could be taken. But I think that where we are in a particular point in history in the agricultural business and food security and prices that my honourable colleague just talked about, does it not make sense that this oversight be corrected through the expansion of the exemptions, which I agree is the right language, and I would have a great discussion with Senator Wu at some point about carve-outs and maybe over a roast beef or something. But in any case, I just wanted to get your opinion on, should we not be concerned more about food security and the next generation and the current generation of their ability to actually get into the business?
Senator Wells.
Thank you, Senator Quinn. Excellent question. And really, it's a trend that we're seeing, fewer family farms, because it's hard to make a go of it on that small scale, on the family farm scale, or even on the small industrial scale. And we do see, especially across the prairies, and we see it in the fishing industry in the Atlantic Canada as well, in the larger companies that have economies of scale, buying up smaller farms, smaller operations, because they can have a better margin. But it's still difficult. I can't think of anything in the food supply chain that's going down in price. Nothing comes to mind. So I think it's a really important point. If there are fewer and fewer farm operations, it gets closer and closer to monopolistic tendencies where the consumer will have no say in the price. They'll simply be in a take it or leave it position, whether it's the consumer or the value-added consumer, companies that put value into grain and cattle. So I agree with you. It's untenable, and anytime you increase the price of something that's already on dangerous ground, doesn't make it any better.
Honourable Senators, we'll do one question for the three senators remaining, and if we have time, we'll do a second round if needed. Senator Dalphond.
It's good.
Senator Dalphond. Would Senator Wells take a question? Absolutely. Thank you, Senator.
The second round for the second one, I guess. So the first question is about the, if I read properly the bill, the carve-out, to use an expression which I think is rather proper. The carve-out is good for 8 years, but it can be extended by the government afterwards if they believe that it should be extended for another 8 years or 10 years or 20 years. Don't you think it would be better if the bill was also providing the government can reduce the 8 years, which has been provided here, if next year or in 2 years from now or 3 years from now, there's the technology advancements, makes it interesting to use another technology and to instead to use something else based on solar power or wind power than natural gas, propane to dry the grains, for example.
Senator Wells.
Thank you, Senator Dalphond. That's an excellent question. And of course, any government can do anything it wants as long as it has the will of the chambers. that this is established at 8 years in this bill. Of course, a government can extend it, but a government can also repeal it or make an amendment to make it 6 years, or to make it any number of years. Any amendments. I didn't hear what you said, but any amendment can be made to any existing legislation.
Senator Dalphond will come back to you for a second round. Senator Carter?
Thank you very much. Senator Wells, will you take one more question from me?
I will, Senator Carter.
Thank you. I thought this was an important bill for you to bring forward, and I think we're all appreciative of it, and particularly for farmers who have real challenges in producing food for Canadians in the world market. And I appreciated your observation that this was really not a political point, although with greatest respect, I thought Senator Batters evolved it a little bit in that direction, as she has on occasion done here. Let me make a statement, which is that your point about price takers also means in some respects that they have to take the price in the market, and they're not the ones driving up grocery store prices, because that's part of what they take rather than influence. My question really is that one of the strategies around carbon pricing is to try to incentivize people to make other choices. It's clear that that's a real challenge for farmers in this context. But removing this from the carbon pricing regime does kind of disincentivize that direction. And whether you're enthusiastic about carbon pricing or not, it is tried to use market-based tools to incentivize. Do you have suggestions? Are there other options that can generate that kind of incentivization in this area so that we will actually end up with successes? Say adopting this but doing some other things that can inspire hog producers and grain farmers in their initiatives.
Senator Wells.
Thank you, Senator Cotter, and you're right. There are other things that can be done. There can be a rebate on equipment that's done towards moving away from technology that requires fossil fuel, and there are also programs for that. The idea is not for the farmers and growers and ranchers to take the margin and run and go, that's great, we have this. Each of the ones that I quoted have said our plan is to use this to invest in innovative technologies, something different. And if it wasn't the case, I wouldn't say, as I did a number of times in my speech, that there are no alternatives currently there are no alternatives that are market ready in either equipment or fuel. That natural gas and propane are transition fuels is very positive. It's not coal. If you said, okay, we won't give you benefit of using natural gas or propane, if there's still a penalty, they're going to choose the cheapest fuel they can, which in many cases is coal and oil.
Gagné.
Madame la Présidente.
Senator Gagné. Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Speaker.
Thank you. I was raised on a farm, so I have a good idea of the challenges farmers face, and so I understand the complexities. But I was wondering, Senator Wells, you're aware of the fact that Bill C-8 proposed and implemented a refundable tax credit for farm businesses operating in backstop jurisdictions starting in 2021-2022. There have been some concerns raised that with the adoption of this bill, Bill C-234, this would result in a double compensation of farmers that could result in further complexities such as clawbacks. Therefore, I'm wondering whether you have any comments and if you think the Standing Senate Committee on National Finance could lend its expertise on perspective on this matter.
Senator Wells.
Thank you, Senator Gagné. Of course, you can't double dip on a benefit, whether it's a rebate or an exemption. You can't be exempted if you're rebating. You can't be exempted. If you're exempted, you can't get a rebate, and I think that will be built into the system. That's a policy decision by CRA, and that doesn't need to come through legislation. That the ability for them to do that by directive of their minister is already there. I think whether it's up to the will of the chamber, if this goes to committee, and if it does go to committee, where it might go. If it's a question of taxation, it may go to finance. If it's a question of something specific to farms, it may go to agriculture. I don't know. I'd leave that to the will of the chamber. But for exemptions and rebates, it's one or the other, and I think that's well recognized.
Okay, second round, Senator Dalphond, vous aviez une autre question?
Yes, maybe. Thank you.
Senator Dalphond, did you have another question?
Have 10 other questions?
Yes, Senator Dalphond.
There's only 5 minutes left. So my first question was really about the power granted to the government councils to extend the date, but there's no such power granted to the government councils to reduce the date. The date. So I guess you said, well, you can amend the law. Well, to amend the law is an interesting exercise. But we know, for example, my question is the following, and it follows on the questions from Senator Gagné. We know that based on the carbon tax, every year the government will make a calculation of what the farmers are going to pay for the tax on carbon in Saskatchewan. And that becomes the pool for Saskatchewan that is going to be divided at the end of the year between the farmers of Saskatchewan based on the cost of operating their farms, not the cost for propane, not the cost for natural gas. So you're saying that if this bill comes into effect in June of this year, the amount that was set aside for the farmers of Saskatchewan in January and has to be shared between the farmers will no longer be shared, or that it will still be shared? And if it still be shared, I don't understand why the farmers have to gouge their price to get a higher price because they get the tax back. So I want to understand the logic of the arguments because I fail to understand it.
Senator Wells.
Thank you, Senator Dalphond. I don't think I said that, and I don't agree if you said that the farmers will gouge the price up and that they will share in those spoils. This is simply an expansion of the already existing exemption for equipment or fuel that doesn't exist. So if you have a grain dryer and it's powered by natural gas or propane, this would allow that to be exempted from the carbon tax. If there is something that does exist on an industrial scale, and we hope that exists within the 8 years, then that would qualify. I don't know if this is answering your question. The other part is, we know that laws can be repealed. We spent the first 2 years of the Trudeau government repealing laws, and this can happen to that. We can amend it from 8 years to 6 years, or depending on the available, not just the available fuels, but the available equipment on an industrial scale out there. And I think farmers know best. I'm not a farmer, but I think they know best when they say this, and in consultation with the development of the bill, with former Senator Griffin, with MP Lawrence, with MP Ben Lobb, who sponsored this bill, who are familiar with the farming communities and heard from the ranchers, the growers, and the farmers in developing this, that 8 years seems a reasonable amount of time. If it's to be extended, that's the will of the chambers, and that's where I would go with.